All right.
Welcome to the May BJCP Study Group webinar. I'm your host, Doug Piper, and I really appreciate that you're sharing your beer journey with me as I grow my beer skills, and we'll just learn them all together. We're going to go live at the top of the hour, but right now I really appreciate all of you that have joined us early. I mean, that's the best part. You kind of get a peek behind the curtain as we get started here. So I've got Pat Fahey over here. Pat, how are you?
Not too bad. How are you doing?
I am doing awesome. Now, what I would love to hear from our audience right now is our audio and video clear? I would really appreciate, just write it over there in the chat. The chat's over here on I believe the left-hand side of the screen for you guys. And let me know if you see anything there. I would love to hear that the audio, you can hear me. Pat, talk a little bit.
How's it going, guys?
Make sure you can hear Pat, especially. Let's see. Peter says, all good. Thank you, Peter. So I assume that
survey size 1, we'll be fine.
There we go. All good here. That's Joseph Hertz. Thank you, Joseph. And Edward O'Neill, looks clear to me, loud and clear audio. So I think that means we're good. So just to remind everybody, please use the chat over there. It's just great to kind of build community. That's one of the great things about webinars is these are live, they're spontaneous. And those of you that have been on my webinars before know sometimes they can be a little more spontaneous than I like to plan them to be. But that's the fun part about live. It's the fun part. So I just want to mention to several of you, while you're here, there's an Ask a Question button down there at the bottom. Looks like we've got 5 already. So, Pat, you're going to be busy at the second half.
Can't wait.
So ask your questions. Most importantly, we have a poll. And this gives Pat a feel for what our audience is like. So far, about 50% of you have mostly just read Cicerone materials, and we've got about 30% that have passed certified beer server. So certified beer servers, thank you. We appreciate you being here. We also appreciate everybody else. And I suspect there's a preponderance, and I probably should have put this question in there, of BJCP judges. Because, Pat, as you know, we have a group called the BJCP Study Groups. We have a 201 group, a 101 group, and we have a Mead group. So these are a lot of fun where people ask hard questions.
Can't wait.
and actually, kind of the idea of this was drawn from the BJCP, or the Beer Judge Certification Facebook group. And then the 2 that Cicerone runs, the Beer Sisters in Canada, and then John Scholl, I guess, has got it in the United States. And I was pestering John. I said, we need something like that. And so we started one for the BJCP too. Audio and video is good. So what's happening in Chicago, Pat? Anything new, like Homebrew Con's coming up?
So, I mean, HomebrewCon not here. There's nothing too crazy going on in Chicago. We have the first nice day in weeks, which I appreciate. But yeah, nothing too crazy going on here. And I have kind of like a relaxed travel schedule over the next few weeks, which is unusual. So I'm pretty psyched about that. But I will be at HomebrewCon at the end of June out in Providence. And we're doing a workshop out there geared towards some topics from the Certified Cicerone exam. We'll be doing some off-flavor tasting. We'll be doing some training on style discrimination and tasting techniques and other sorts of things. So that's one of the things that I'm definitely looking forward to that's coming up soon.
Oh, I love your all-flavor classes.
I don't think it's going to be quite as extensive as the one that you came out to, but we'll definitely go through several of the basic flavors and talk about them.
I was like a deer in headlights. That was, but what a great experience. I have never forgotten it, and I have learned my all flavors much better since then. And that's one of the foundations of the study groups as we're sharing kind of those tricks and tips.
Awesome.
So what's new in Cicerone? Anything cool going up there? You and Ray doing anything?
Ray's in Vietnam right now. It's one of the big things that's been going on for quite some time now has been our work in international markets, which I know BJCP has done a fair amount of as well. You know, we've worked with folks like Gordon Strong and Kristen England, talking about several of their translated version of the guidelines as we've been translating a lot of our materials. So I think right now you can take the certified beer server exam in 4 or 5 languages. You can take it in English, Spanish, Portuguese, French, and Korean. And we're currently working on Chinese and Dutch.
Oh, wow.
So that's one of the frontiers that we're starting to work on, kind of helping to influence, shape, and improve beer service and beer culture in other parts of the world. And then another big piece.
We're about 15 seconds from going live.
15 seconds. I was just going to say the other thing we've got going is, you know, we've been working on these Road to Cicerone course books, and I'm going to talk a little bit about those while we're going today. So,
and I love those books. So it is the top of the hour, and welcome to the May BJCP Study Group webinar. I'm your host, Doug Piper, and I really appreciate your joining me for my beer journey, and we'll grow our skills together as we learn all these fascinating aspects of beer. I really, really appreciate your time. I'm a certified Cicerone and a BJCP beer judge, certified. My beer journey is relatively short compared to Pat's. I've only been doing this about 18 months. So, and I'm probably doing it the hard way, but I want to continue to rise. I'm having a great time with it. And the BJCP study groups has been one of the ways that I can share my journey amongst us all. I'm working towards taking the national written exam coming up. And so we've got aspects of that we're sharing on the groups. And actually, we're going to run a written exam course online. So that's going to be fun. So, but you're not here to hear from me. You're here to hear from Pat Fahey. And Pat is going to help us with one of the specific questions from the BJCP written exam. We're going to be talking about the styles and the styles comparison, and this book that I love in the series. I mean, these things are awesome. And I just really felt like, I don't know that there's a lot of people in the BJCP that know how good these books are. And Pat, I've already told you, I was a skeptic and did a lot of my work before I actually bought some of the books. But I'm a convert now and love these things. But anyway, we're going to move into the webinar in just a moment. But I think we're ready to talk about this guy. What do you think, Pat?
This one?
Yeah.
Hopefully everybody has a beer in front of them. If it's not Sierra Nevada Pale Ale. First of all, great to be on here. Thanks for having me. And good to talk to all you out there. Hopefully you have a Sierra Nevada Pale Ale in front of you. If you don't, hopefully you at least have some beer in front of you. Just going to go through really quick. Doug, you want me to talk about just the standard rundown of the profile of the beer?
Well, I'd like to get yours.
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean,
yep.
So, you know, you look at a BJCP score sheet and it always starts with aroma. Some people advocate going for aroma before you go for appearance. I don't really fall firmly into one camp or the other. I've heard people say, you know, delicate aromas blow off immediately. In my experience, that's not really a thing. By and large, there are some aromas you acclimate to quickly, but beer aroma tends to be pretty stable. So I usually look at appearance first. I don't have a fancy light out. I've got just the light of day. So, you know, I'd peg this at a burnished gold to a light amber. High clarity, but not brilliant. I'm going to call that an eggshell head with moderate to high retention, maybe medium low in size. talk about the aroma. Whenever I go to assess aroma, when we're judging, Cicerone teaches a number of different aroma techniques. We have 4 or 5, depending upon how deep you're trying to go in. So I'll start with something like a distant sniff, just to pick up. That especially helps with really volatile things, or if the beer's light struck. Go in for maybe a short sniff. Proceed and do a little bit longer sniff. And then maybe do a bit of a covered sniff. Now, I feel like it's cheating using this beer a little bit, just because we use this beer all the time for trainings. So I'm going to talk about it from 2 perspectives. I'm going to talk about it from how this beer is presenting, and then how this beer normally presents, because the one that I have is packaged at the end of January, and so it's a little bit long in the tooth. Normally on this beer, and hopefully for many of you, the first thing that's presenting up front is going to be hop character. A lot of times when this beer is really fresh, it has a lot of grapefruit, maybe orange peel, a little bit of pine needle, and then kind of like a white flower floral type character to it. For those of you that know like specific chemical compounds, usually a fair amount of linalool in the profile of this beer. Mine has some of that. There's some amount of that orange peel. It's morphed a little bit into more of like an orange marmalade character. And like the floral character is still present, but it's a little bit more subdued. In general, on the nose, what I imagine some of you might be getting from a malt perspective be a little bit of a light, like toasty, bready sort of character. If you are like me, having one that's gotten a little bit older, the malt has shifted a little bit more to the forefront here. And so I'm getting a little bit more honeyed and caramel-like character than you tend to get when the product is really fresh. The hops have fallen back a little bit, and some of those malt flavors have kind of come to the forefront and then deepened in character, which tends to happen as beer oxidizes. In terms of yeast character, I'm not getting much on the nose, not much in terms of any esters or anything else. So if you've waited this long, you should go ahead and taste the beer now. And one of the things that I always tell people when they're tasting a beer is to make sure to pay attention to characteristics that you can't smell. So the taste, first and foremost. And in beer, usually the ones we're looking at are primarily sweetness level, bitterness level, and acidity level, occasionally salt or salinity level. And in this, I get very little residual sugar, pronounced level of bitterness, kind of like a medium to maybe slightly medium level of bitterness. No discernible acid, no salinity, nothing like that. After that, you can think about, have the characteristics that I picked up on the nose changed much? And I would say, some of in this beer that I'm drinking, the hop flavor is even less present on the palate than it was on the nose. It's really driven by a lot of caramel malt character, the beer that I'm having. And there's also a little bit of kind of like a black tea or like loose leaf tobacco note that you sometimes get in beers as the hops fall off a little bit. The beer were a little bit fresher. I would expect to see more kind of like a crisper, like toast bready malt note. And then once again, more of that kind of like grapefruit peel, orange peel, pine needle hop character that you tend to see in this beer. Mouthfeel, it's like kind of right down the middle. It's medium body, moderate level of carbonation. I'm not picking up any astringency. I'm not picking up any alcohol warmth. Not getting any other palate sensations like creaminess or any other strange textural things, which I would kind of expect here. So, if I was sitting down to judge this beer, my overall impression would be it tastes like it was once a well-made American pale ale, and at this point, it's gotten a little bit old. It shows some of the telltale characteristics of a beer that's seen, a couple, like 2, 3, 4 months of age. So.
Well, I was more fortunate. My grocery store had one in April. But
that's better.
Yeah, well, I cheated. I got it at the Sierra Nevada in Mills River. My wife and I were up there last weekend, and I said, well, I better get a fresh one. So, but, April was the newest that they had there. So, even this is 5 weeks old, but it's very nice.
It's a delightful beer. It's a classic for a reason.
Yeah. And actually, Pat, in all our commercial calibrations, we have yet to do one with a Sierra Nevada Pale Ale. So I am glad you chose that one because it's one that's widely available to a large number of people. And the opportunity to have a Sierra Nevada Pale Ale and sit across from someone with your level of experience, it's just a marvelous thing. And that's the great thing about this technology. We can do it together. So it'd be interesting to know how many people out there are joining in with us. So if you don't mind write in the chat, hey, I had a Sierra Nevada Pale Ale. I know Tom Bradley said he forgot to get his, but looks like others, I hope have got them because I certainly had enjoyed it. Well,
yeah, and to Tom out there, like, crack another beer, it's fine. I'm going to be a lot more interesting to listen to if you're having a beer. So I would say dig right in, grab something you like.
Oh, Pat, you're always a real pleasure to go to a presentation. By the way, I've been to one of Pat's presentation, and he talked all day above all the packaging equipment at the Green Man Brewery in Asheville, North Carolina, and it was and an audio system that didn't work. So he's a phenomenal speaker, and you're going to be at HomebrewCon, right? Speaking of speaking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was talking about it a little bit beforehand, but I will be doing a workshop at HomebrewCon. I think it's the day leading into the conference, and it's a conference add-on. But we do a little bit of training in terms of topics that are present on the Certified Cicerone exam. Like I was saying earlier, we're going to do some off-flavor tasting, talk a little bit about tasting technique generally, talk about style discrimination, have a lot of fun, and drink a few beers. So,
well, this will actually be my first HomebrewCon, so y'all are going to have to be gentle. All right, we're going to move into the webinar momentarily, Pat, but there's just a couple of housekeeping items I'd like to go through for those of you that are new. And I know we had quite a large number of people who maybe this is the first time they're attending one of the BJCP study groups. So this is a BJCP study group webinar, and that is mostly in name only. We are not officially a sanctioned part of the BJCP, and we're not a sanctioned part of the Cicerone organization either. Pat and I are here on our own, just expressing our own opinions and having fun with you guys. So I noticed one person there in the chat had an issue with their screen, not being able to see it. In most cases, if you just refresh your browser, that will fix any video or audio issues. The only audio issue it doesn't fix is if by chance you have your system on mute. And a lot of us do that and forget to turn it off. So be sure to check that. Now, we also have 3 more webinars scheduled. This is new news for most of you, except my Patreon members. The Patreon members are aware already that we have 3 webinars coming up. The first one, and I'll talk about that, is May 30th with Eric Fowler of White Labs. And Eric is going to talk through beer descriptors. He's got quite an extensive course that he charges for, actually, in White Labs, and he's going to share aspects of that, not the same as the paid course, but he's going to share aspects of that in our webinar. So that's May 30th. I will be sending that email link out along with the replay from this webinar. Pat says he's going to share his slides, and I'll have links for the other signups. Also, if I look distracted, I am clicking on a lot of different things to keep things going smoothly. So I am not on my cell phone. Speaking of that, I need to turn the sound off. And there we go. And let's kick into the main part. So this is part of a series of webinars that I'm helping the BJCP study groups with. And if you're not a member yet of the BJCP study groups, that's a Facebook group, I would encourage you to join. It is a group of members. If you are not yet BJCP anything, you haven't taken the online exam, you can get in the 101 group. There's a 201 group that requires you to have passed the online exam. And there also is a brand new MEAD group that is forming, and there's just a few of us now. So all I would say is if you just do a quick search on Facebook groups for BJCP 101, 201, or MEAD, those groups will show up, and please answer all the questions. You will not be improved if you don't answer all the questions, and the answers are obvious. Another aspect of this is I volunteer all of my time. Pat is volunteering his time today. But there are some real out-of-pocket costs to produce these webinars. And I want to thank my Patreon supporters, Brent Dingus, Jerry Pringle, Gene Jockey, Clay Bunn, Paul Clammer. Other supporters include Joe Darden, Dave Mason, Daniel Sitka, Antone Com, John Lee, and Sean Kness. And if I've left you out, I will try and make sure I get you in the next webinar. But thank you, supporters. There are real costs, and you help offset those costs, and those help us keep these webinars going. So I appreciate that very much. As I mentioned before, everybody will get an email with the link to the slides, the previous webinars, and I'll include links to the BJCP study groups. And the other 2 webinars that we've got coming up is Bob Hall on beer characteristics. And Bob is a real expert on oxidation, amongst a lot of other things, but that's going to be a lot of fun. I've talked to Bob. He's a great guy. And we've got Jason Johnson, and Jason is going to be talking to us on June 7th, and he's actually going to be covering the BJCP online exam. So those of you that are in the 101 group and want to move up to the 201 group, this will be a webinar you'll really enjoy. But Jason is just a great guy. A lot of people have talked about his series that he has in the barley pot maker. So, Pat, I am done with all that stuff. We're ready to hear from you. So let me introduce you. I think our audience already knows most of it, but let's talk about it one more time because it's just a real pleasure to have you sharing time with the BJCP study group. Pat is a BJCP Master Beer Judge. He is also a Master Cicerone. And do I remember right that you were the youngest Master Cicerone certified?
I was the youngest to pass. I don't think I'm currently the youngest anymore, but I still am when I passed, I was the youngest to pass it.
Okay. So other than the class that I went to in Asheville, I think the next thing is you're the content director for the Cicerone Certification Program, correct?
That is correct.
And that's how you and I got to start talking about this and how much help it was, at least for me. to learn for the written exam. So that kind of is what set the stage for this whole webinar. And before we just completely dive into that, Pat, why don't you introduce a little bit about what's going on in Chicago and let that lead into our webinar, or touch on something with Cicerone. Is anything new with Cicerone?
We were talking a little bit about our translations earlier, I think before we got started.
That's right.
And yeah, like I was saying then, international expansion is a big part of what we've been working on recently. That, and once again, continuing to develop additional resources to help people with the higher level exams, Certified Cicerone and Advanced Cicerone. Resources for the master exam, we usually look outside of the program for those, just because there's so much material to cover for that test. But those Road to Cicerone course books that you've been talking about have been a big thing that we've been working on. Should I share over my little slide deck now, or?
Absolutely, that would be perfect.
All right, I can go ahead and do that. Let's see. Is that working? Is that up there?
It is, and I will probably take it full screen in just a moment, but I would say let's hear what you got to say.
Sounds good. So I had a slide for the calibration beer, but that doesn't really matter anymore. But one of the things Doug asked me to do was talk a little bit about myself first, just very briefly. So I got into this whole beer journey the same way a lot of people do. I was a big beer nerd, was really excited about beer, was doing a lot of reading and learning more about beer as a beverage. And that led me to do some homebrewing. I, to this day, have probably homebrewed maybe 10 batches, probably a little bit less. I was not an exceptional homebrewer. But that's kind of how everything got started. And I moved very quickly from there into doing BJCP judging and using that a little bit to work towards Cicerone certification. So I figured out pretty early on that I wanted to go ahead and take at least the Certified Cicerone exam. And I started doing some judging to prepare for that. I took the BJCP exam for the first time in, I think, December of 2010. So I took the legacy exam, which is an awful experience. Anybody who's been through that can speak to that. And if you guys have any questions about that later, I'm happy to talk about what it was like to have to do 10 essay questions and judge 4 beers in 3 hours, which is a far cry from what they make you do today. So went through BJCP. I think I hit national on my first time taking the test. Took my Certified Cicerone exam later that year in 2011. Did some work with Cicerone, kind of started doing grading and proctoring, and then a few more projects. And then I started on full time with them in 2012 to manage their exam content for Certified Beer Server and Certified Cicerone. And then from there, I've just kind of grown within the company. I figured out as soon as I got here that I needed to take the master exam to be able to avail myself of all of the opportunities that I could have here. So I took the master exam in spring of 2013. I passed and became the 7th person to pass that test. There are 18 of us now. And yeah, it's all been gravy since then. It's just been a good time. So, and I didn't put it on there, but I got my Master BJCP, I think, in 2015. I figured that early on, I was kind of like, I don't know that I'll ever accrue enough points to get to that level. So I didn't have any reason to retake the test, but I started judging a lot professionally. So doing GABF and doing competitions in other parts of the world, like Cerveza Mexico down in Mexico, Copa Cervezas de America down in Chile, recent competition down in Panama, and accrued points through those competitions. And so finally figured I should go ahead and sit down and retake the written to bump up my score a little bit. So I took that in 2015 and had to brush up a little bit before sitting for it, but made it through. And I'm also happy to share any kind of insights that I gained in that process as well. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the insights I have in terms of preparing for that S0 question, which people tend to dread a lot.
Did you pass it the first time?
The first time I retook it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I did.
Wow.
Well, I mean, the thing is like, that was 2 years after I took the Master Cicerone exam. And the Master Cicerone exam is like a really extreme 2-day long grueling test of knowledge and stamina. So at that point, I feel like I had the knowledge in place to perform and pass the BJCP written at that level. But I didn't go ahead and actually do it until I realized that I was going to have enough judging points to actually make it matter. So.
Okay.
Yes. So, talk a little bit, Doug's mentioned them a few times. One of the big things that we've been doing a lot recently has been working on developing these Road to Cicerone course books. I don't want to just sit here and do an infomercial for them, but I do want to talk about them a little bit, because I'm going to kind of branch off from some of the things that exist in these books to talk about ways that can help you prepare either for upper level Cicerone exams or for, the written test for national level or master level of BJCP. So we've released 5 of an eventual 7 books in this series. The latest one we released was on American beer styles. And the style ones are probably the most applicable to folks doing BJCP study because they do focus in on a specific area of beer styles. So this one in particular and kind of the general format for the style books, which include German and Czech styles, British and Irish styles, and then the next one will be Belgian styles, covers sort of history of American beer culture, follow that up with some information on common ingredients used in American brewing and some processes that are unique to American brewing. So in the case of American brewing, primarily looking at things like cereal mashing, or I believe we also do high gravity brewing in there as well, which is not necessarily, actually, I guess homebrewers do sometimes do at least high gravity wort production. So it is something that you sometimes see, and for similar reasons. And then obviously a focus on the styles that exist within the American canon. And this is kind of just an example. I think this comes from the IPA section. That's a picture of a black IPA and a white IPA, 2 styles that basically don't exist at this point anymore, but that, you do still see from some smaller regional breweries from time to time. So the way these books are laid out, they cover readings from, readings of both material that we've produced as well as outside readings that we recommend. But really kind of the thing that I think a lot of people have enjoyed about these books and what has made them so effective are the activities and the tasting exercises that exist within the books. Our original purpose in designing these was to help people who couldn't come attend a course with us be able to basically experience the hands-on portions of a course at home on their own or with a study group. And so a lot of these activities are really, really excellent things that you can do with your own study group or even on your own at home. And I want to sort of jump off from there to talk about how you can use some of those tasting activities to help you study and prepare for, for S0 or for the certified exam if that's the direction you're going. So there are kind of, yep, go for it.
Pat, yeah, I was just going to add one thing. I know I've got Garrett Oliver's book, and a lot of us have those, and it's a rather intimidating book because it's not something you read from cover to cover. But that's one of the things I loved, about the course that you had because it directed you not only to specific sections, but even subsections of there that are really applicable. Now, again, it's mostly for certified Cicerone or Cicerone in general, but it's just well put together.
Yeah, I always tell people that we've been really proud of the books once we get them out. Every time I'm working on one, and like I said, we're working on Belgian styles right now. I absolutely hate the book. It's a terrible, terrible thing because it takes a tremendous amount of work to put those things together. But
I'm sure,
like Doug mentioned, all the readings come from Oxford Companion to Beer, and we do make sure we go through and vet all of those articles. I know there's been some criticism over the years that some of the articles are less excellent than others. The book on the whole is a phenomenal resource. I mean, truly, it is the best single resource that I know of, but we do make sure to go through and pick out selections that are appropriate to what we're trying to get people to learn. We're not just saying, go read everything on this topic because it may go into not enough depth or it may go into way too much depth. So we did work to kind of vet all of the articles that we send people to. Anyways, so to talk about some of the types of tasting, one of the types of exercises that we really feature the most and that we push the hardest are comparative type tastings, where you're doing comparative tasting between 2 to 4 closely related styles. And that's really going to, it's going to be reminiscent of the same types of style groups that you might encounter on the S0 question. And through those comparative tastings, what I always tell people to do, sit down with 2 or 3 closely related styles, taste them side by side, write out the flavor profile for each one. And then after you're done, go back and read through your description alongside the style guidelines and think about, does this beer that I just tasted, does it fit the style guidelines well? Does it deviate from the style guidelines in any way? That's one of the best ways I know of to really solidify the knowledge behind those styles. One of the things that people have such trouble with is memorizing all of this style information, because it is a tremendous amount of information. But tasting in a comparative fashion between styles can be a really, really effective way to help not just ingrain that information, but also it gives you kind of a tangible touchstone to think about when you're trying to think about a given style. Like if you can be American Porter, what's the malt character like on American Porter? And you can think back and say, I remember that comparative tasting I did where I had Founders Porter, and I pitted that up against Fuller's London Porter. And I can utilize my memory of that beer to sort of help solidify and recreate the profile that's expected of that style. So that's one of the types of tasting that we do that I really recommend. Blind comparative tasting. This is something that shows up on the certified Cicerone exam, and it's a really great exercise. The basic exercise on the certified exam is we give you 2 potential styles. So we might say, is this an American Porter or is this an Irish Stout? And you need to taste a given beer and determine which of those things or which one of those styles the beer actually is. This is a really great exercise for, once again, firming up your style knowledge. And the way that we tend to teach people to approach these is before they even taste the beer, look at the 2 styles and try to figure out what you should be tasting for to distinguish between the 2. If it is like that example, if it's American Porter versus Irish Stout, you might say, I would expect the Irish Stout to be lighter in body. I would expect it to be a little bit drier, more highly attenuated overall. I would expect there to be no perceivable hop character, whereas there might be some perceivable hop character in the American Porter. Style grids.
Yeah, I love those too. Are you going to touch on those? Because I found those so useful.
I certainly can. It's funny because we hear that so much from people, and so I will talk about that a little bit. So doing that exercise of going through, taking 2 or 3 styles and trying to pick apart the differences that you could taste between those different styles is a really, really good way, one, to help make sure that you know those styles really well, but 2, just to study in general, because, and this comes from my background before I worked in beer was in tutoring and education. And just from like learning theory, you tend to learn best not by reviewing information, like looking at notes or rereading things, but by being quizzed. The process of trying to dig through your brain for that information actually strengthens your ability to then recall it at later points. So doing this sort of thing where you are regularly quizzing yourself, picking 2 closely related styles, saying American Pale Ale, American Amber Ale, what differences could I note between those 2 styles? And trying to do it from memory and then going back and actually looking at the guidelines and seeing whether or not you are right. That's one of the best ways to practice and study.
One of the speakers we've got coming up, and we don't have a date set yet, is Rob Ord. And Rob is a sommelier instructor. And he has a course called Study Tech, and he's going to provide the details. But I've been going through it, and I really enjoy it. But he talks about learning it from something using from multiple different directions. So tasting it, writing it, mapping it. And it's many of the things that you cover in the book. I mean, this, how would you map it? Well, there's a way. And so...
Yes.
So
I was just going to say, go for it. No, you finish up.
Well, it was just, that's what I like about the exercises is versus my early attempts in Cicerone before I got your books. I was trying to read and memorize, and going through it, just all the exercises were extremely enlightening.
Yeah, so much of what we've built into those books have been the things that we have found that have really worked for people as they prepare for the exams. I fall into the same camp. When I was studying for Cicerone, I didn't go to any guided courses or anything like that. In retrospect, it would have made the journey a lot easier, but I too am like a very I'm going to do it on my own kind of person, but we've tried to go through and provide things that we've found really, really help people. What I was going to say is the activity that Doug has been holding up are these grids that we provide where we have people map out sort of like the style parameters of ABV and IBUs for a group of related styles. And, I don't love to just memorizing statistics or memorizing style quants. It, in my opinion, is not super important. It's much more important to have a general idea for where they lie. The grids are not so much about helping you memorize numbers, but what they do is they allow you to sort of easily look at a group of related styles and go, oh, I can see how this one sort of is outside of the pack in terms of its alcohol content or in terms of its bitterness, either high or low, or, oh, this style has a really narrow allowable alcohol level, whereas this one has a huge range that's acceptable. So they're like you were saying, Doug, it's just another way to visualize the relationships between styles, which the more different ways you can let your brain try to process that information, the easier it's going to be for you to then recall it at a later point.
That's what Rob said, that under stress, the more different directions, kind of like if you set up camp out in the woods, don't just learn one path to get to your camp, go like east, west, north, south, and make sure then you'll always know where your camp is. That's what he was saying, because under stress, he said just brute memorization is going to fail. So, yeah.
It takes more time, but it makes it more, it makes it stick better. And the thing too that I like to, it's hard because when I go out and I teach people, I do recognize that some of them are just like, I'm just trying to pass this test. But from my perspective, that's not the purpose of the test. The purpose of the BJCP exam is not to show how much you memorized the week leading up to your exam. It's supposed to be it's an attempt to track your ability to be a good judge of beer. Same thing kind of with the Cicerone exams is it's in an attempt to measure how well you understand how to talk about beer styles and beer flavor, beer food pairing, brewing process and ingredients, all of these things. It's not about how much can I know right before I sit for my test. It's how can I understand these topics well so that, at least for people who are doing Cicerone, which is intended for people who work within beer, how can I then go and apply these concepts to be better at my job or to give people a better beer experience when I interact with them? So that's my general take on that. The other kind of tasting that I was going to bring up that I think is also really important is to do contrast tastings within a style. So not just to have one example of a given style and to taste that every time you sit and taste American Porter or Czech Premium Pale Lager, any of those things. If you can sit and taste 2 or 3 of each style, and once again, this takes a lot of time, this gives you a much better foundation of knowledge related to that style, because styles are not just one beer, unless it's like California Common and then it's Anchor Steam. But in general, styles are not just a description of one specific beer. They encapsulate a wide range of different possibilities. And so to make sure that you understand that range of possibilities, tasting different examples of different styles is extremely useful. We have, in the books, we tend to put in a few of those for some of the more prevalent or more important styles. Like I know in the German book, we put one of those in for Weissbier, since that's such a prominent style in the German canon. But doing those sorts of tastings is really effective when you're learning about the styles. I know when I went through BJCP, originally I was part of a study group where we get together every week for like 4 hours, and we'd taste through 2 or 3 commercial examples of each of like 10 styles or so and talk about them and compare them to the guidelines. And we did that. We went through all of the styles in the guidelines.
But speaking of a multifaceted approach, now, not all the Cicerones I've ever talked to went through BJCP judging or judging of any sort. How did you find that your judging helped you with your Cicerone, to kind of look at it the opposite way?
So a couple things. When you look at like the Cicerone curriculum, there are 5 main topic areas: keeping and serving beer, beer styles, beer flavor and evaluation, brewing ingredients and process, and beer and food pairing. And those outer 2, keeping and serving beer, which at the higher levels primarily focuses on draft systems, and beer and food pairing, those 2 are absent from BJCP. But those middle 3, beer styles, beer flavor, so understanding off flavors or on flavors and where they come from, and then brewing ingredients and process, that's all very firmly within the BJCP canon. So like I said, I did BJCP before I did the certified Cicerone exam, and preparing as intensely as I did for that BJCP written exam put me in a really solid place to where when I was preparing for the certified Cicerone exam, I was really only focused on learning about draft systems and learning about beer and food pairing, because I already had the other material down well. Judging itself is really useful because it gives you experience and opportunity to taste blind. And blind tasting is, I would say, like the single most important thing to do before you sit for any tasting exam, whether it's for Cicerone or BJCP, because you can do tons and tons of tastings where you're tasting, I'm tasting an American Porter against an Irish Stout, against a tropical stout, against that's great. Those are very useful. It is very, very important to do some of those tastings blind as well, because when you sit for the exam, you don't know what the beer is in front of you exactly. And there's a big psychological element to it where you need to have practiced sitting through that blind tasting experience in order to really perform well when you do that on an exam. So I would say the process of, I don't know, I started judging. I think I judged my first competition at the Minnesota State Fair in July or August of 2010. I took my certified exam in May the following year. I probably judged 8 or 9 homebrew competitions in that time period. All of that practice blind tasting was immensely helpful when it came time to actually sit down and have to do blind tasting on an exam.
Yeah, I had judged quite a bit before I took my first certified Cicerone test, and those 12 beers sitting out there and having to go through all 12 and 4 of them having off flavors, and the off flavors you can smell, and there's a little bit of I think a little cross-pollination of that off flavor, it seems like. And it adds, as Rob Ord talked about, the stress, because that's it at the end of 3 or 4 hours worth of writing. So, yeah, a multifaceted approach is a good way to study it.
As much as you can. So, should we dig into actually talking about S0?
Please.
And do you want me to go through? I know we talked about American Lager, Czech Premium Pale Lager, which we abbreviate here as just CPPL, and German Pils. Do you want me to go through and actually list out things like the qualitative parameters, like talk about the appearance, aroma, or do you want me to just talk about kind of how I would approach some of these sections?
I think the approach would be most useful, Pat, because we've got all these numbers to go through, and I think it's more learning the approach.
Okay, fantastic. I would agree. As I was thinking about it, I was like, I can sit here and I can walk you through how I'd answer this question, but like a lot of it is just pulled from the BJCP guidelines, which you can also read. So,
yep.
So there are a couple things, and I lay it out first, just like, I think on the website they assign it as 6 points, 2 points, 1 point, and 1 point, but I broke it down in percentages. One of the things that I think is important to keep in mind, because people talk about, you sit down and they give you 3 styles that are very similar, and that I think brings up that makes it challenging for people. One of the things that's important to think about is 90% of your score for each individual style has nothing to do with what the other 2 styles are. Those first 3 categories, qualitative style parameters, so giving the aroma, appearance, flavor, and mouthfeel, you need to be able to do that for a style regardless of what the other 2 styles are. Giving a unique, they don't phrase it quite this way, but when I looked at it, it was like, talk about something either ingredient-wise, process-wise, or like history of the style-wise that makes it unique. It doesn't matter what the other 2 styles are, truly, for that. Commercial example is unique to the style. Really, the only place where the other styles come into play is the similarities and differences section. And so I will talk a little bit about how I look at that section in terms of, mapping out the best way to figure out the similarities and differences when you have a group of styles. Now I'm going to throw up something. I'm going to throw up in the chat a link to the Cicerone blog because I can. Oh, unless it won't paste. I'm getting the spinning wheel of death. So, nope, we're good. I'm fine. So Ray wrote a blog post a while back about what characteristics to present when you are discussing a beer style on an oral exam and the advanced or master exam. And the tips are useful for that. But furthermore, like it talks about kind of a way to organize the way you think about styles and how to then present that information so that you do a good job of presenting the full profile of the style. And if you look at it, like it's the same exact thing you want to do when you sit to answer this question on the BJCP exam. So, first portion, 60%, the majority of the question is focused on just, can you bring up the sort of core qualities of the beer, the aroma, appearance, flavor, and mouthfeel. And when I think about those things, appearance, I just make sure that I kind of have things in mind that I'm going to cover for each one of those. And we don't need to, I see some people pulling, or is that, Doug, are you scrolling on the actual thing?
Yeah, I thought that might help.
I would say just save the link and check it out later, because it's a lot of text. It's a lot to read. But it's a good read. I mean, it provides a lot of useful information that's kind of supplemental to what I'm talking about right now. So, when you're talking about appearance, always note on appearance, color, clarity, head size, and head color. Like always when you talk about appearance. When you talk about aroma, cover, malt, hop, yeast, other. So the three kind of core things, but also talking about, those other characteristics if you have a beer that maybe is barrel aged or is produced using wild yeast or something like that. Same kind of thing on flavor, but add in, you want to make sure that you're talking about level of bitterness, level of sweetness, the balance of the beer. And then on mouthfeel, once again, when I learned BJCP, I learned 5 attributes of mouthfeel that you always want to make sure you mention. That's carbonation, body, attenuation, carbonation, body, any astringency, alcohol warmth, and then anything else like creaminess or other texture sensations. So once you have sort of those parameters in mind as like the framework of the stuff you need to mention when you talk about a style, what's going to help you lock these in is a lot of the exercises that we've already talked about. So doing some of those comparative tasting exercises, but also just like studying as if you were about to do a comparative tasting exercise. Go grab any triplet from that list of F0 examples and sit down and think and say, if I had to distinguish between these by taste, how would I do it? And see how much you can pull up and use that as a way to quiz yourself and to further solidify yourself on the styles. The other thing, just as kind of like a shortcut or a thing that can help you, because, when people look at it, it's like, oh my God, I have to memorize the malt character and like all the different hop flavors and and it's overwhelming. The way I've always thought about it is like, think about it in groups and then remember exceptions to those groups. And what I mean by that is, so you've got a beer, hopefully for any given beer, you can more or less pick out what its color would be. Like if I'm like, color's a stout, what color's an American stout? You'd be like, the beer is black. So for a beer that is black, you can take a pretty good stab at what the malt flavors are going to be like for that beer. All you really need to memorize is, are there any styles that are black in color that don't exhibit like really strong roasted characteristics? And so maybe if you were talking about a beer like a Schwarzbier, a thing you would want to memorize about Schwarzbier was like, it is a relatively dark beer, but it's not like really heavily roasted in character. When you're thinking about hop characteristic, a lot of times hop characteristic goes along with where the style is from. If it's an American style, you're going to get American hop traits of like citrus, pine, those sorts of flavors. If it's a continental European style, like you're looking at like a German Pils or a Czech premium pale lager, a lot of that is going to be noble hop traits, things that are like spicy, herbal, floral. So just kind of, and then on yeast characteristics, is it an ale or a lager? If it's an ale, it probably can show a little bit of ester character. If it's a lager, it probably doesn't. There are some that allow it, like in this particular question, American lager allows for low levels of yeast-derived fruitiness, either esters or potentially also like low-level acetaldehyde. You memorize those things that differ from what you should expect just knowing that this beer is an American beer and a lager beer. So by kind of learning those broad characteristics that tend to be true of large groups of styles, it helps you lock down a lot of characteristics without having to say like, oh God, I memorized the flavor profile for American light lager, and like now I need to memorize the flavor profile for American lager, and it's totally different. Like most of the stuff is the same. You just need to memorize the things that make the style unique.
That's actually something similar to what Al Boyce said. He said in general, all three are similar except with one characteristic.
Mm-hmm.
And he said you need to figure out what that, odd characteristic that is not similar to the other two. Mm-hmm. What would you say that is in these three?
Oh man, let me cover that when I get to the similarities and differences.
Okay, that's perfect.
But I would generally agree with that. I mean, I studied for my first BJCP exam off of Al Boyce's guide back in 2010. Al Boyce was one of the first people I judged with. In fact, I did judge with him at that because he's a Minnesota guy too, and I was originally from Minnesota. When I judged at the Minnesota State Fair, I judged with Al, I judged, I think, with Steve Piatz, and I judged with Kristen England, which was like a pretty intimidating first group of people to judge with as like a 22-year-old first time beer judging, particularly Kristen. If he ever hears this, you can tell him he's a terrible person and I love him dearly, and he'll appreciate that. But he was extremely intimidating as a new judge. So moving on. The next section, unique ingredient, process, or background information. Once again, like I was talking about with the previous section, you want to memorize the things that stand out about beers. So like if you look at the vast majority of American beer styles, when you're trying to think about what makes their production unique, like the malt bill is usually going to be 2-row or 6-row malt and pale ale malt, and maybe something else, and that might be something that makes it unique. Like I look at these styles and I know, American lager, one of the things that makes American lager unique is that it allows for a fair amount of adjunct in its process. It allows for, I think in the guidelines it says up to 40% rice or corn, but usually it's going to be 30-35% rice or corn, maybe up to 40%. Process-wise, same thing with American lager, because it's got rice and corn in it, that it's got to get some sort of cereal mash. Background information. Historical points, I would say, are, I'm like sitting here and saying like, oh, it's easy to pull them out, but I've also been looking at beer styles for like 8 or 9 years in this capacity. So, Czech Premium Pale Lager, the first like pale, it's the first really truly pale beer to be produced on a very large scale, and it's gone on to inspire German Pils and plethora of other styles. Once again, when I think about like how I would approach this, part of it does come down to just memorization and just working with the styles and learning to understand, the little things that make them distinct from one another. Czech Premium Pale Lager, pretty much always featuring Saaz or Saaz hops, Moravian malted barley, German Pils being a German interpretation of the Czech Premium Pale Lager style, those sorts of things. And I don't grade, I've graded some BJCP tasting exams. I've never graded the written exam, so I can't tell you for sure how much detail they look for on this. But at least the way that the question is worded, it only asks you to give like one thing from any of these categories. So as long as you can pick out one thing in one of these areas, that should make it easier to answer the question. Something that I didn't mention up front, because it's not a way that I learned, because as I mentioned at the very beginning, I'm a terrible home brewer. Another really good way to get familiar with a style, to like learn it inside out, is to brew it. And so for any of you guys out there that are brewing, which I would imagine, in the BJCP community is a lot of people, if there's a style where you're like, man, I really feel unsure in my knowledge of that style, consider brewing it. There's no better way to familiarize yourself with kind of like the ins and outs of a style than by learning what ingredients it's made from and kind of doing some of that background research to either find a recipe or put together a recipe, and then actually making one and tasting it against the guideline. So, and I can wrap pretty quick. Commercial example.
That wasn't for you. That was for the audience. Yeah, I'm sorry I broke your flow.
No, it's all good.
But actually, since we're kind of at a little break unintentionally, I just wanted to remind everybody we are going to do question and answer following Pat's presentation. And what do you think? You got maybe 10 more minutes, Pat?
Oh no, I can probably do that. I've got like 2 more slides, so.
Okay, well, let's say 10 minutes, maybe. And then and for those of you that need to go, we completely understand it. It is the top of the hour, and I just want you to know how much I appreciate you spending an hour with us. And those of you that can stay, Pat's going to continue for about 10 more minutes, and then we get into the Q&A. So if you've got to leave at that point, feel free, and if you've got to leave now, we understand. So Pat, let's continue on. It looks like I'm hearing good for another 20. Keep going. I'm okay, whatever you all are up to. So
Sounds good.
I think we have a resounding yes. So let's keep her going.
All right. So commercial example comes down to memorization. But once again, if you've gone through and done work to do style comparison tastings, you're going to have tasted commercial examples. So hopefully by doing that, that will help imprint in your mind at least a couple of commercial examples for each style, at least for each style that you taste. The last area though, and like I said, this is the one where it matters which 3 you are given, is to figure out similarities and differences. And like Al mentioned, I guess on the Facebook post, it can be useful to start from the similarities. So one thing that I usually tell people to look at first is I say stats here, and BJCP doesn't make you memorize the numbers, which is totally fine. I use the stats as stand-ins for things. So like IBUs, I don't really care too much what the exact IBUs number are, but like have a general feel for what the bitterness level of the style is like. Have a feel for what the color of the style is like, for, what the starting gravity is like. Is it like a really high gravity beer? Is it a moderate gravity beer? Is it a low gravity beer? Have a feel for what the ABV range is like. Have a feel for what the attenuation level is like. If you examine each of these areas, it's going to give you some things that you can pick apart in terms of similarities and differences between the styles. So just like when I look at this group of 3, if I just go through each of these, so ABV, there are some slight differences, and I think American Lager is just a hair low, but they're more or less the same from ABV. So that's a similarity. IBUs is a huge area of difference. American Lager is very low in bitterness. Czech Premium Pale and German Pils are about the same, but German Pils is usually a little bit more perceivably bitter because it is drier. So that's examining IBUs. You look at SRM, they're all pretty pale styles, but you can differentiate. American Lager and German Pils are going to be pretty pale. Czech Premium Pale is going to be like a little bit more in the gold range, so maybe a little bit darker. You look at OG and FG on these styles, and I didn't pull them, so off the top of my head, I would say they're probably similar on the OG front, and I would imagine finishing gravity is probably lower on American Lager and German Pils. So once again, those 2 styles are a bit more highly attenuated than Czech Premium Pale. That's an area of difference that you can look at. And then the other thing, so like I said, you go through kind of those stat categories and look at, are they all the same or are there differences in either one of those? And then the other area that I'd say to look at is flavor. And once again, you're looking at malt flavor, hop flavor, yeast flavor, and it can be the type of flavor. So this isn't a great example because American lager doesn't have like a lot of American hop flavor. But if it was something, if it was like American pale ale versus best bitter, one of the differences there would be they both have moderate hop flavor, but American pale ale is more in like the citrus pine category or other American hop varieties, whereas the best bitter is more in the sort of like green tea, earthy herbal family. So for these styles, if I look at them, malt American lager might be lightly grainy, but usually has very little malt character. German Pils is going to be like light graininess, maybe a little bit of cracker, a little bit of light breadiness. Czech Premium Pale Lager is usually like rich, bready malt character, not like super intense, but at least of this group, it's going to tend to be like the most forward in malt character, and usually in those kind of like bready, biscuity, maybe even probably not toasty, but rich bread character. Hops, American lager can have a little bit, but tends to have no hop character. German Pils is usually going to be somewhere in the light to moderate, like herbal floral, especially like floral, spicy, minty character. Czech Premium Pale, once again, sort of in that herbal, spicy category, specifically like Saaz hop flavors. And then on the yeast front, American lager, kind of unique for a lager, can feature low levels of yeast-derived fruitiness. Czech Premium Pale Lager, very unique for a lager, allows for some amount of diacetyl, which is definitely a big distinguishing factor of these three styles. And German Pils, from like a yeast perspective, should be relatively clean. So that's kind of, when I sit down and do a similarity and difference question, I don't have to do these questions very often, but we do write questions that are somewhat similar to this for the advanced and master exams. I have to write the rubrics for them. So this is usually how I look at, if I could lay out all of the different similarities and differences between these styles, this is sort of, it's not really a grid, but the different categories that I look for to try to determine which areas are similar between the styles and which areas are different. And once again, like I said, when we teach people on how to do blind style discrimination, we tell them before you sit down and taste, look at the styles that you're given and think about these things. Think about what things you should be tasting for that are going to be different between the styles. You can do that exercise without ever sitting down to do a tasting. Like I said, just grab any of the triplets from the list of styles as practice and go through and say, okay, I'm going to go through each of these. I guess it's like 9 or 10 different categories, and look for the similarities and the differences in each of those categories. And that can help you paint a really robust picture of the similarities and differences. But it's also, once you do it, it becomes a very quick and natural process. Like if somebody asks me about, I got these two styles, what are the differences between them? My brain just kind of goes through each one of these just automatically because I've done it so many times. I didn't prepare the similarities and differences between these styles. It's just like knowing the styles because I've done a lot of work with them, and then thinking about each of these categories.
So Kristen pressured you into it.
Kristen did?
Yeah, your experience.
That was part of it. That was early on.
But what's most similar or most different? If we go back to Al's suggestion that there's kind of an odd man between those three, how would you go about deciding which one was the oddest of the three, or how would you decide which are the two are most similar and that leaves the other one as the oddest?
Well, and my understanding too on that question is that you aren't just trying to pick one out of the three that's the most different. You're trying to illustrate, right. You're trying to find things, if you can, find similarities amongst all of the styles, find things that are similar between pairs of the styles, and then, find things that separate one style out, or find things that separate styles from one another. So biggest similarities out of this group, you're looking at about the same alcohol content and about the same gravity on each of these beers. And like I said, numbers aren't all that matter, but like the alcohol content does give you a pretty good view into the overall intensity of the flavor profile of a given beer. So alcohol tends to be similar across these styles. Color, pretty similar across these styles. The types of malt flavors, there's some similarity there, but the level is very different. When I look at differences, American lager, at least to me, is very clearly the one that is the most, like, the odd one out, in that it's, and I didn't put on here, I actually would add a couple more things to it. I didn't add mouthfeel traits, so, body and carbonation. American lager is really light in body, it's pretty highly attenuated, has low bitterness, it has very low levels of each of the flavor categories. It stands out to me as the one that has the most differences, and those are like some very clear differences. When you're trying to work with Czech Premium Pale and German Pils, I start to look to things like, presence of diacetyl, or the possibility of presence of diacetyl in Czech Premium Pale is something that really makes that one stick out. Attenuation is huge for me between those two. German Pils is pretty highly attenuated, and Czech Premium Pale is not. Those are some of the things that I'd probably peg at first. Czech Premium Pale, although they're both pale in color, Czech Premium Pale is pretty much always going to be darker than German Pils. I've never encountered a situation where I did a tasting with a Czech Premium Pale and a German Pils, and the German Pils was darker. Saw somebody say that it was sweeter. CPPL would be. That once again goes in line with attenuation. Since the beer is a little bit less attenuated, it has higher residual sweetness. So, and that too, anytime you can link up the impact that like one trait has on other traits, if you kind of understand the attenuation of a style, it can be less important to know the original gravity and the final gravity. Or if you know the original gravity and the relative level of attenuation, that gives you a good idea of what the final gravity is without you having to think about it or try and memorize it. So that's my take on these ones. I don't know if that's what you're looking for, but
it's perfect. It was perfect. And I was American lager, particularly because of the adjuncts, I would think drives a lot of the big difference, right? Because the adjuncts are really going to add very little flavor except maybe a little corn, and all the other flavors are going to be so muted compared to those other two.
I would say that's part of it. The adjuncts definitely drive a lot of that beer's, one, its high attenuation, two, its low malt flavor. But that's, at least from my perspective, it's not the whole story, because honestly, I think one of the bigger differences here is hop character. Like, you see very little to no bitterness in American lager versus the other two, and that's just because there's not a lot of hops in it. There's not a lot in American lager, which is, it is both like the pro and the con of that style. So it depends what you're looking for.
Yeah, but of course that makes it very hard to brew.
Absolutely.
Well, are we ready to move into some questions, Pat?
I am ready to move into some questions, and I can, yeah.
Okay. Well, there's your contact information. Let me pull that up full screen. So if anybody's got to leave right now at the break while we're going into the questions and answers, Pat, if people want to get in contact with you, how's the best way for them to get in contact with you?
Oh, man. So that handle works for Twitter and Instagram, and I think I looked at Twitter last 18 months ago. So if you want to drop me a message on Instagram, I will do my best to respond. I can be pretty poor at that, but I will try.
Okay. Well, we'll also put whatever additional information in the follow-up email that goes to everyone. So I'm going to knock that slide off. You're not going to need your slides going forward, correct?
Nope, I'm good. Okay.
So I'm going to knock those off. And again, anybody that needs to leave at this point, the Q&A, please, I really, really thank you for your time. Appreciate you joining the May BJCP study group. And no, we've got 3 more webinars. We got another one this month, and we've got 2 more at the end of the month, and you'll get that information in the follow-up email. So thank you very much. So with that, Pat, we're going to move into the questions. I will read those to you. We have 10 questions.
Fantastic.
So, and we will vote them up. Let's see. The one with the highest votes is where we will start. Okay. So, first one comes from Edward. Are there any issues about comparing American styles versus European or foreign style due to the potential problems with transportations from faraway sources versus what might be difficult to find if you were in the country of origin?
Yes, if you're trying to do it via tasting. As like a lovely anecdote for anybody who's been doing BJCP since pre-2015 guidelines, I remember when I learned about the style Bière de Garde, in the 2008 guidelines, it talked about how Bière de Garde is supposed to have this kind of like mushroomy basement cellar kind of character that's very hard to replicate in homebrewed beer. And then the 2015 guidelines came out, and there's a note in them specifically that says, you know, there should not be any sort of like mushroomy basement character. It's just that all the people who wrote the guidelines, the only ones that they had up to that point had been affected by cork taint. They were basically corked beers. And so it was that kind of like moldy cork character that they thought was like a characteristic of this beer and was just a handling flaw. So yes, absolutely, that can cause issues. In a lot of cases, there are a few things. So one, you know, check date codes as best as you can. Try to find a store where you can get things as fresh as possible. But in a lot of cases, what we'll do in our classes is we'll try to find American-made versions of beers that are fairly representative of the style that they're supposed to be. You know, that's not always, you can't always get there by just looking at labels. And it is, you know, it can be a useful exercise to grab a beer that's like, this is a German Pils, let's taste it and see if it matches up with the style guidelines and talk about why it does or why it doesn't. But in a lot of cases, yes, it is important to make sure that you get beer that's pretty fresh so that you can actually experience the characteristics the way they're supposed to be. I know like another example, and I think that this appears in the new BJCP guidelines as well, is that like a lot of, I think the older guidelines on British bitters hewed more towards like a caramel type character in the malt. Fresh bitters don't have a ton of caramel character. They can have a little bit, but not too much. In a lot of cases, it's because most of the ones that we could get from the UK were old by the time we tasted them. And so they had developed some of that kind of like caramel oxidation flavor. So yeah, tasting fresh beer is extremely important to developing a good feel for what the style is supposed to be like.
So is maybe the best answer, Edward, road trip, you know, either to a good bottle shop or the country of origin.
If you can make it to the country of origin, that's the best way to do it. But that is a luxury that most of us do not have. So, you know, try to find, and then it depends where you are, but there are a lot of cities that have smaller breweries that specialize in certain areas, like breweries that make primarily German styles or primarily British styles. That can be a great place to seek those styles out.
Well, and Joseph points out good homebrew. So that's a very good point. Mm-hmm. All right, Edward, great question. We will go to the next one. This is from Doug, and I think you've really answered this one, but are there any patterns in the S0 styles list grid that could help in preparing for the written exam?
Oh, man, I don't know. I'd have to look at the list. You know, I think Al sums that up well in that they're always going to give you three styles that are relatively similar. Like if you read through that list, the triplets are more similar than they are different. But also, like I said, you know, only 10% of the question actually comes down to you identifying similarities and differences. When you get to that portion of the question, it can help, I think, to start by trying to identify what is similar between the styles, and then looking to traits other than that to see what may be different between the styles. But the way that I tend to approach it is I go through my list of, I'm going to look at color and bitterness and alcohol content and attenuation and all of those different things, to just by going through that list, I make sure that I don't miss anything. And it seems like a lot of things to check, but it's like so many things. If you do it in the same way every time, like regardless of what the styles are, you have kind of a set of parameters that you always check on, you're going to get to a point where it just becomes natural that your brain just goes, okay, I got to think about these styles. And you just kind of chew through each one of those things.
All right. That helps. And Chris says, it's not a question, but my glass was slightly dirty and now I'm feeling a bit guilty.
Happens to the best of us.
Yeah, little Cicerone. As a matter of fact, it happened to me in the webinar with Marilla.
Excellent.
So yeah, that was, it happens to all of us.
It's true.
The next one, American styles, with only a few exceptions, are by and large American versions of mostly UK beer styles. How would you capsulize in general terms how the American beer styles differ from their European counterparts?
Oh, that's easy. It's more booze, more hops. Like simply, by and large, just about any American style is a slightly boozier, slightly hoppier version of some other style. And in a lot of cases, it is some sort of UK style. That slightly hoppier could be in terms of more hop flavor and aroma, could be in terms of more bitterness. It could be both. But in general, that's the trend you tend to see. You look at foreign extra stout next to American stout. You look at, I can't remember if it's English porter or British porter. It's English porter. If you look at English porter next to American porter, British brown ale next to American brown ale, it's like, it's a little bit boozier, maybe half a percentage point, sometimes more, and then a little bit more bitter and usually a little bit more hop flavor and aroma.
I like that though. That is very concise. Thank you. Good question. Our next one is from Tom. The most challenging part of this question for me is the similarity of the styles that seem to be chosen. What's a good technique?
And I think there's two other parts to this. To a good technique for memorizing the style guidelines. And we already touched, I think, on a lot of the things I would recommend for that, and kind of what you were talking about too, this, approach from as many different directions as possible. Try to interact with the guidelines in as many different ways as you can. Read the guidelines on their own. Taste beers while you read the guidelines. Try to recall the guidelines when you have the beer in front of you. Try to recall the guidelines when you don't have a beer in front of you. And then the other piece that I always think is just helpful for memorizing anything is just look for groups. Look at, when you're trying to think about what the overall alcohol content of a style is, make groups of this is all of the beer styles that fall like between 4.5% and 6% alcohol. This is all the beers that fall into this category. Look at groups that are already made for you. So many of the style names have the country of origin in their name. What characteristics kind of exist within that name? If it's a Belgian style, it usually is going to have some amount of ester and phenolic character in its yeast profile. If it's an American style, pretty good chance that it's going to have some amount of American hop character to it. So as much as you can, try to find trends in the styles that's going to allow you to say, oh my God, I can take 20 styles here and I know what the hop flavor is going to be like just because I know that they're all American styles. And that, I think, that can really revolutionize the way that people interact with them, rather than trying to go through and just read the guidelines from top to bottom and memorize them one at a time.
Well, and that, as I recall, that's what a lot of your books cover. they kind of dive into that aspect of it. That's not just like reading the BJCP standards.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Good question, Tom. Thank you. Next one is from Edward. And Edward says, within the past year at the Sierra Nevada website, I think. Yeah, okay, Sierra Nevada website, they printed the original recipe using Ken Grossman's handwritten notes. And all of the hops were Cascade. Now, I'm assuming, sorry, something just clicked up here. Okay. But I am assuming they used whole cones versus pellets, which I normally use to brew with pellets. Is there a notable difference a judge might be able to pick up on whole cone versus pellets? Ooh, good question.
So the bottom line question there is, are there differences in flavor, aroma, anything between whole cone and pellet? And my general answer is not so much. You know, the vast majority of breweries out there are going to be using pellet or extract or a combination of the two. Most commercial systems are set up to brew. I mean, commercial systems are going to be set up to brew with either whole cone or pellet. And to my knowledge, there are only 3 really big breweries that utilize whole cone hops. Sierra Nevada is one of them. Another is Deschutes, and the third that I know of is Victory. Outside of those 3, the vast majority of breweries are going to be using pellet hops. You talk to the folks at Sierra and they will tell you that they tested using pellet hops versus whole cone and that they could tell a difference. And so they stick with whole cone. In my experience, I haven't really seen much of a difference between the two. You know, most of the differences come down to how much beer you lose when you use whole cone hops, and also the fact that whole cone hops tend to oxidize a little bit faster than pellet hops because there's more exposed surface area. So yeah, you could brew a perfectly fantastic Sierra Nevada Pale Ale clone with pellet Cascade.
Well, that's a great question. I've actually been in their hop room several times, and it's a wonderful experience.
I would imagine aromas. So.
All right, we've got a couple more here, and then we will be done. I've got one from Galen Johnson. And Pat, what's your go-to way to detect old, aged, oxidized beers besides just cardboard?
Oh, it's such a great question.
Yes.
You know, and I've actually had this conversation with the guy in charge of the sensory program over at Half Acre. We were talking about oxidation flavors. Oxidation is a very complicated topic, and there are a tremendous variety of flavors that can come about as beer oxidizes. Trans-2-nonenal, which is that paper cardboard character that you sometimes see in really late stage oxidation, unfortunately got like a lot of attention in the 60s and 70s, and was studied as kind of like the oxidation flavor. And so unfortunately there used to be, and there still is to an extent, like too much focus on that flavor as being what oxidation is about.
I totally agree.
There are a lot of characteristics that appear in beers in early stage oxidation, you know, in the 2 to 3 to 4 month period, long before you ever see any T2N develop in a beer. I'll just quick give like the rundown that we give when we teach classes for Cicerone. So first thing that you tend to see with oxidation is a drop in hop flavor and aroma, because those are some of the more delicate components of a beer's flavor profile. You tend to see development and that's going to be in beers that are highly hopped. So pale ales, IPAs, anything driven by hop character. In those beers, you also see development of a compound called dimacinone or beta-dimacinone that has, there are a lot of different descriptors for the flavor, but the one that I usually give is kind of like a loose leaf tobacco or shisha tobacco or like black tea. It also has like a little bit of like an artificial grape character to it, but that characteristic is very, very prominent in IPA that's like 1 to 3 months old. As beer gets older beyond that, you see what we refer to as malt shift. And that's just that, like, depending upon the color of the beer, you see development of these malty oxidation flavors. So very pale beers will start to take on kind of like a honey type character. Mm-hmm. Beers that are like a dark gold, light amber will start to take on caramel, maybe toffee notes. Beers that get a bit darker will kind of tend more towards toffee, and then like dark and dried fruits, things like raisin, fig, plum, prune, all of those sorts of characteristics. You know, when you hear people talk about what they really like in American barley wine or like barley wine in general, it's all of this like rich toffee and dark fruit characteristic. And those characteristics are typically not present in fresh barley wine. Those are aging characteristics, and those characteristics will appear in just about any beer that you age that's in that sort of same color spectrum. It's just that for whatever reason in this high octane style barley wine, we've decided that we like those flavors when they show up, and so we age it intentionally to develop those flavors.
Alex is asking about sherry.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I see somebody talking about sherry. You know, one of the reasons why sherry is such a great descriptor for oxidized character is because most of the flavors that we associate with sherry are related to the oxidative processes that go into making that beverage. Sherry is an aged product. It's aged to develop oxidation character. And so a lot of the flavors that you see in sherry and port similarly are these kind of like nutty, and in some cases, especially in the case of port, like a lot of dark and dried fruit kinds of characteristics. It takes on flavors much akin to raisins. You see the same flavors in beer as it oxidizes. You know, oxidation is just a chemical process that tends to occur in things as they get older. And so some of the flavors that you see in oxidized beer are the same flavors you see in oxidized wines. There are differences, but there is some amount of overlap.
Well, I tell you, Bob Hall is going to spend a lot of time on that in his webinar. So I would encourage you to grab that one, Galen. The next one is, let's see, we have kind of several here. Okay. This is from Merlinus. Pat, don't you do a Cicerone skill for the homebrewer workshop? Maybe you did it at last year's HomebrewCon, excuse me.
Yeah, so the workshop that we're doing this year it has basically the same description, but we're going to change it up slightly. Some of the elements will be the same, which we figured would be okay since last year was in Portland and this year's in Providence. We figure we'll see a slightly different crowd at this year's HomebrewCon. But even if you did attend the one in Portland, there'll be some slightly different elements to the one that we do this time around.
So if you've been before, it'd be well worth attending again, is what I'm hearing.
I would say if you have the time free, go for it. Good.
Well, that might be one of the ones I sign up for. And we've got one last question here. This is from Merlinus also. You talked about discovering bière de garde before. I did the same and brewed one, but I added hibiscus to it. Is it appropriate to put hibiscus in bière de garde?
In a classic bière de garde, hibiscus would definitely not fit into the profile of that style. But, you know, one of the beautiful things about brewing is there are so few rules in terms of what we can and can't do. So, you know, if you want to add any sort of ingredients to a given style, I always say, like, go for it. I wouldn't enter it in a competition as a classic bière de garde. If you wanted to enter it, I'm trying to think what specialty category hibiscus goes into. It's probably one of the spice or vegetable type of categories.
What I would think.
If I had to guess, I'd have to look. It's been a long time since I've been a competition director. But
I bet you could get that job if you wanted it.
I ran a competition in Minnesota for a little while back when I was living there, but haven't since then. And at this point, mostly just participate as a judge. And the reason it's tough because specialty categories vary from competition to competition. GABF, you're using the BA guidelines, and their specialty categories are pretty significantly different than the specialty categories in BJCP. So yeah, I always have to check if I'm going to answer truthfully.
Okay, well, that is the end of our questions, Pat. And before we kind of wrap things up, do you have any closing comments on, again, the value or the crossover that there is between some of the Cicerone materials that are available and helping us, people like me, working on the written exam, to pass that? How would you summarize?
Like I said, somewhere in there, BJCP has, like, the materials for the BJCP exam has a tremendous amount of overlap with those three sort of like central topics: the beer styles, beer flavor and ingredients, and then brewing ingredients and processes. So any material that we cover that's in one of those avenues is going to be pretty directly applicable back to the stuff you're doing in BJCP. I mean, like I said, I did all my prep for Master Cicerone, and then a couple years later, just sat down and reviewed a couple things, and then sat and got a master score on the BJCP written exam. So the material is the same. It's it's a slightly narrower scope of content. And the nice thing about those course books is that they're targeted at individual areas. So there are 4 books on beer styles. Those are going to be all about beer styles. There's not anything in there we have one book that is just dedicated to keeping and serving beer. If you want to know more about draft systems, that's a great resource to grab. It's not going to help you on any of your BJCP exams.
No, but it's essential for certified Cicerone.
It is useful for that. So like that's the one that I would single out and say, if you're purely interested in studying for BJCP exams, you have virtually no use for that book. But all the other ones that we have out currently are directed at topics that also appear on BJCP exams. So.
Well, and there's also a test, right? Which doesn't hurt you. You can take over. So that's a little bit of a practice, right? Can you talk about the test?
I did not even mention that. Yeah, each one of the course books has an associated exam on our website that comes with it. That exam, the exam itself, I think, is 72 questions, but it pulls from a question bank that's between like 150 to 200 questions on that topic area at like the certified Cicerone level. That can be a great way to kind of like make sure that you're really solid on that topic. And just in terms of like where Cicerone and BJCP kind of line up, I tend to pin certified Cicerone around the same level of knowledge as like national BJCP judge, which I think is fair to say, given that I got national on BJCP 6 months before I took the certified Cicerone exam. So those two, I think, line up pretty evenly. If you're at a level where you can hit national BJCP, you probably are at the same level in those topic areas where you can hit certified Cicerone.
Well, the other thing I was going to mention about the tests, they're time tests, as I recall, and then also you can take them over and over again. Mm-hmm. And so it's a great, again, another way to practice different ways, as Rob Ord said, all the different angles. And it's a separate charge for the test, right? You've got like a package. You can buy the book or the book with the test, I think.
We sell all three. So you can buy them together and it's slightly cheaper, or you can buy just the test or just the book. So depending upon what you're looking for, you can go any one of those routes.
Okay. And just for my credibility, the BJCP is not endorsing me or sourcing this in any way. I'm really just sharing a resource that because I went through the Cicerone program that I have found just a great resource to studying for the written BJCP. Well, Pat, that I think brings us to the end. We've had a huge number of people, a bunch of questions, and this was a fantastic webinar. Thank you. I really appreciate it.
No problem. Happy I could sit down with you guys.
Well, it was a lot of fun. And everybody in the audience, we had a great crowd, one of our biggest crowds. So thank you for having such a good showing for Pat. I appreciate all your time. Some of you have been on here almost 2 hours. So sorry
about that.
Well, they can get off at any time. And that's the beautiful thing about this. We do value your time. Thank you for doing that. If you can help me out a little bit with the expenses for these, they are very real, and I would appreciate that. That's a big help. The webinar is recorded and will be sent along with anything that we mentioned to send during the webinar. So I think we're going to get your slides. Maybe we'll figure out a way to get some contact information of some sort. And we will get those out to you. And my email address is in every email. So if there's something we missed, you just let me know and I'll get it to everyone. And that will include the links to the next 3 webinars that we've got coming up. So a lot of good stuff going on in this early summer. So with that, Pat, any closing comments?
Thank you guys for being here, and go out and have a good beer.
There we go. Well, thanks everybody. Enjoyed it. It was a great fun, and have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Cheers.